The sound of hooves stumbling against the soft arena floor echoed louder than any voice in that quiet morning. All eyes were locked on the center of the ring, where a pale, skinny horse with clouded, lifeless eyes struggled to remain standing. He looked fragile, out of place, and uncertain. There was something broken in him, as if time had punished him too harshly. A few spectators whispered, some even smirked. A blind horse here? What kind of show was this supposed to be? On the other side, a woman knelt slowly. Her face was mature, lined with years of emotion and sun, and her brown hair was pulled back into a practical ponytail. She wore a dark vest and work pants, the kind of outfit you'd expect from someone who spent most of her life around fences and dirt. But in that moment, everything else seemed to disappear around her. She extended her hand gently, fearlessly, and softly called, "Skylar." The name left her lips like a secret the wind had been waiting to hear. The horse lifted his head slightly, nostrils flaring as he caught her scent. There was no light in his eyes, but there was something deeper: memory. His tense muscles began to tremble, not with fear, but recognition. And then, slowly, with great effort, Skylar bowed his head and knelt. A wave of silence swept over the crowd. It wasn't a trick. It wasn't rehearsed. It was something far more profound. It was remembrance. Sarah Holt felt the tears before she even touched him. She had spent years believing this moment would never come, that he was gone forever. Skylar had been sold without warning while she was in the hospital recovering from a surgery that nearly took her life. Since then, she had searched. Farm auctions, rescue shelters, dusty barns in forgotten counties. But she never found him. Until today, when an anonymous invitation to a special showcase led her to this arena. Those who had mocked him moments before now sat in stunned silence. There was something sacred in the air, something that couldn't be explained by training or familiarity. Skylar couldn't see her, but he felt her. Her scent. Her presence. The soft rhythm of the voice that once saved him. This wasn't obedience. It was love, raw, faithful, and unbreakable. As Sarah pressed her forehead gently against his, both of them still kneeling, something long lost was quietly being restored. But no one there knew. This reunion was only the beginning. After Skylar knelt, there was a long pause, one that seemed to hang in the rafters like mist. Then, slowly, the audience began to shift in their seats, murmuring in hushed voices. Some looked away, ashamed of what they had thought. Others stared, unable to believe what they'd just witnessed. Sarah remained close to Skylar, her hand resting gently on his face. She didn't speak. She couldn't. Her throat was tight, and her heart was pounding in a rhythm that didn't belong to the present. It belonged to years ago. From the edge of the arena, an older man stepped forward. He wore a flannel shirt tucked into worn jeans, and his face was carved with lines of sun, age, and guilt. Dean Butterscotch. A former rancher turned local horse trader, he was the one who had acquired Skylar after Sarah's hospitalization. Dean cleared his throat, his voice low but firm. "I didn't know he was yours. I swear, Sarah. I never would have taken him if I'd known." His words hung heavy in the air, met with silence. Sarah slowly turned to face him, still kneeling beside the horse. Her expression wasn't angry, but it wasn't forgiving either. "You knew he had someone. You knew he wasn't just some rescue case." Dean lowered his head. He didn't argue. He couldn't. Everyone in that town had heard rumors of the bond between Sarah and the pale stallion with the fierce eyes and gentle soul. But after she vanished from public view for months, people assumed she had given up. They moved on. Skylar was moved like a forgotten object, passed from barn to barn, none able to tame him. From the stands, another voice cut through. He never let anyone near him. Not really. It was Mildred Fudge, an elderly woman with tightly pinned gray curls and a sharp tongue. They said he'd go wild if anyone touched his face. But look at him now. Like a lamb. Her words weren't meant kindly. They were laced with disbelief, maybe even fear. As if what they saw had no earthly explanation. Sarah ignored her. She was focused on Skylar, whose breathing had calmed, whose body no longer shook. There was a peace between them, a silence full of answers no one else could hear. But deep down, something gnawed at her. If Dean had truly found Skylar by accident, why did the invitation to the event arrive with no sender? Who brought Skylar here? And more importantly, why now? Because some reunions aren't just chance. Some are orchestrated. And someone in that crowd knew the whole story, but hadn't said a word. Sarah could still feel the weight of Skylar's head in her hands, but her mind was already spinning. The moment had been real, raw, unforgettable, yet it didn't feel complete. Something about it felt staged. Skylar hadn't just ended up in this town. Someone had planned this. Someone had wanted her there. She glanced over the crowd, now dispersing slowly, and her eyes stopped at the back row, at a man who hadn't moved once during the entire scene. He stood out not because of anything flashy, but because he stood perfectly still. Arms crossed. Face unreadable. Middle-aged, clean-shaven, dressed in a dark wool coat despite the mild weather. His eyes were locked not on Skylar, but on Sarah, as if he were watching her reactions, not the horses. When their eyes met, he gave the smallest of nods. And then, without a word, he turned and walked out through the side door. "Did you see that man?" Sarah asked Dean quietly, still beside Skylar. Dean looked confused. "Which one?" he asked, scanning the arena. But the man was already gone. Sarah stood slowly, her hand still resting briefly on Skylar's neck. "I think someone brought him here, on purpose. This isn't over, Dean." Dean looked uneasy, running a hand through his graying hair. "Well, maybe it's fate," he said, trying to force a smile. But Sarah wasn't buying it. Not anymore. Outside, the autumn wind carried a bite. Sarah pulled her vest tighter around her. The man's face stayed with her, familiar in a way that made her stomach twist. She'd seen that expression before. Not in person, but in a photo. Years ago. In an envelope tucked inside a letter she never answered. Back then, it didn't mean much. Now, it might mean everything. She needed answers. And she knew exactly who would have them. Back at her truck, Sarah opened the glove compartment and pulled out an old leather-bound notebook. Inside were names, addresses, and scribbled notes from her years searching for Skylar. Most led nowhere. But one stood out, Reggie Muffin. A former breeder known for buying problem horses, cheap and flipping them at auctions. Last she'd heard, he disappeared after a scandal involving stolen ownership papers. Sarah stared at the name, her fingers tightening on the page. Something told her Skylar's story had never truly ended, and whoever brought him back into her life had just reopened a wound she thought had long scarred over. The drive out to Reggie Muffin's old property was long, dusty, and unsettlingly quiet. Sarah hadn't been out this way in years, not since her early days searching for Skylar. The trees along the narrow dirt road stood like silent witnesses, their branches brittle under the wind. Every bump in the road reminded her of how close she was to the truth, and how far she might be from peace. Skylar's sudden reappearance wasn't just a miracle. It was a message. And she was finally ready to read it. Reggie's place looked worse than she remembered. The paint on the barn was peeling, the gate hung crooked, and the pastures were empty. Not a single horse in sight. She parked her truck by the fence and stepped out, boots crunching over gravel and dried leaves. At the front porch, a rocking chair creaked with the wind, but no one came out. She knocked, once, twice. Nothing. But just as she turned to leave, a voice rasped from behind the screen door. "I knew you'd come eventually." It was him. Reggie Muffin. Thinner, older, his beard now white and wild. His eyes had the look of someone who hadn't slept well in years. He opened the door and leaned against the frame. "You're here about the horse." Sarah nodded, her voice tight. "Skylar. I want to know how he ended up in that arena. And who sent that invitation?" Reggie sighed, motioning her inside with a wave of his hand. "There's things you ain't gonna want to hear, Sarah. But you deserve to know." The inside of the house smelled like old paper, leather, and something burned. Sarah sat on a stiff couch while Reggie disappeared into the back room. When he returned, he held a thick folder, stained and worn. He tossed it on the table in front of her. "Skylar wasn't just another rescue," he began. "He was registered under a different name before you got him. Someone wanted that horse gone for a reason. You think it was about abandonment, but it was bigger than that." Sarah opened the folder with shaking hands. Photos, documents, transfer records, some with her name scratched out, others with names she didn't recognize. But one name stood out, circled in red ink: Harold Custard. A judge, landowner, and a man Sarah once trusted. "He's the one who changed the ownership papers," Reggie said, voice low. "And he's the reason you lost Skylar in the first place." Sarah felt her chest tighten. Skylar hadn't just been taken. He had been stolen, and someone powerful had made sure of it. Sarah hadn't seen Judge Harold Custard in nearly a decade, but his name had echoed in her memory like a storm waiting to return. He wasn't just a respected figure in town. He was someone que todos temían contrariar. Years ago, he'd been a mentor, a supporter of the local horse rescue programs, even donating land for the shelter's expansion. But now, staring at his name circled in red inside that dusty folder, Sarah's blood ran cold. If he forged Skylar's ownership papers, what else had he buried? The town courthouse loomed like a relic from another time. Brick walls, tall windows, and a large oak tree at the entrance. Sarah parked across the street, watching people come and go. She wasn't here to accuse, not yet. She wanted answers first. Clarity. Closure. Inside, the air smelled of old wood and polished tile. A receptionist recognized her and gave her a faint smile. "Judge Custard? He's in his office." "You can go on back," she said, like nothing had ever happened. Harold Custard looked older now. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his eyes, once warm and charismatic, had grown cold and calculating. He stood when she entered but didn't offer a handshake. "Sarah Holt," he said flatly. "Didn't expect to see you again." She didn't sit. "You forged papers to take Skylar from me," she said, her voice trembling. "You lied. You let me think he was gone forever." The silence in the room stretched, heavy and deliberate. Then Harold leaned back and crossed his arms. "I did what I had to do," he said, like it was a business transaction. "That horse was at the center of a property dispute. You were in the hospital, legally unreachable. Decisions had to be made." Sarah shook her head. "No. You made a choice. You took something that wasn't yours." His lips tightened. "I protected that animal from a legal mess. From being euthanized. You should be thanking me." His voice was calm, but his words were poison. Sarah could barely contain her fury. She pulled a document from her jacket, one Reggie had given her, with the judge's forged signature. "This says otherwise. You didn't protect him. You erased me from the records." Harold's eyes flicked down to the paper, then back to her. For the first time, his expression faltered. "You have no idea what you've stepped into," he said, voice dropping. But Sarah did know. And for the first time, she realized, saving Skylar wasn't just emotional. It was dangerous. Sarah left the courthouse with the forged document still clutched in her hand, her breath shallow and quick. The judge's warning echoed in her mind. "You have no idea what you've stepped into." But she did. This wasn't just about a horse. It was about betrayal, power, and control. Someone had tried to bury Skylar's past, and for years, they had succeeded. But now that truth was unraveling, and Sarah wasn't going to stop pulling at the thread, no matter where it led. Back at the stable, the mood was calm. Skylar stood quietly in his stall, his pale coat gleaming faintly in the afternoon light. But as Sarah approached, she saw someone inside the stall with him. It was Tanner McCrumble, the young stable hand who had always seemed a little too curious about Skylar's past. He was brushing the horse gently, talking to him in low whispers. When he noticed Sarah, he straightened quickly, almost startled. "Hey, I was just checking on him." Sarah's instincts kicked in. "How long have you known about Skylar's history?" she asked, arms crossed. Tanner looked nervous. "I mean, people talk. I heard stories." Sarah stepped closer. "Did you send that invitation to the arena showcase?" He hesitated, eyes darting away. "No. I mean, not really. I might have mentioned him to someone. Someone who owed me a favor." His voice cracked with guilt. "I didn't think it would go this far." That's when Sarah realized Tanner wasn't just a stable boy. He had ties to the auction houses, connections she hadn't thought to question. He had once worked under Reggie Muffin, back when he was flipping horses. "You helped move him," she said slowly. "You knew where he was all along." Tanner swallowed hard. "I didn't know it was him. Not until I saw how he reacted to you. Then I knew." A wave of betrayal hit her hard. Someone she had trusted, someone who had stood beside Skylar for weeks, had been part of the very system that tore them apart. Tanner raised his hands. "I'm sorry. I swear, I thought I was helping. I didn't know what the judge had done." Sarah stared at him, emotions warring inside her. Anger, sadness, disbelief, but also opportunity. If Tanner had been involved, he might know what was coming next. Because the judge's threat wasn't empty. Someone was still trying to keep the truth buried. And Sarah was no longer the only one digging. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. The silence on her ranch, usually comforting, now felt heavy, like the calm before a storm. She sat at the kitchen table, flipping through the documents Reggie had given her, her eyes scanning the faded ink and signatures. Every piece pointed to the same conclusion. Judge Harold Custard had manipulated the system to take Skylar away. But the real question was why? Why go through so much trouble over a horse? There had to be something more. As dawn broke, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She answered, her voice low. "Hello." For a few seconds, there was only static. Then a voice, deep, calm, and unfamiliar. "Stop digging, Ms. Holt. Some things are better left buried." The line went dead before she could respond. She stared at the phone, heart pounding. It wasn't a prank. It was a warning. The kind that makes your blood run cold. Sarah drove straight to the stable. Skylar neighed softly when he heard her steps, as if sensing her fear. She ran a hand along his neck, whispering, "We're not going anywhere, boy." But she knew now, whatever this was, it wasn't just about ownership papers or emotional ties. It was about control. And someone was afraid she'd expose something worth hiding. Something bigger than Skylar. Something that went far beyond him. Lorna A. Clare, a local journalist with a reputation for digging into the town's quiet scandals, had reached out to Sarah earlier that week. Sarah had ignored the messages at first, not wanting to make Skylar's story a media circus. But now, she needed help. She called Lorna and arranged a meeting at the diner downtown. Lorna arrived fast, mid-30s, sharp eyes, and a recorder already in hand. "I've been following Judge Custard for years," she said. "And I think your horse is connected to something I've been chasing." They talked for over an hour. Lorna had files, too, whispers of land disputes, hush money payouts, and illegal transfers involving animals used as leverage in property feuds. And then she said it, Skylar wasn't just a horse. He was the last living link to a settlement case that never made it to court. Sarah froze. What kind of settlement? Lorna leaned forward. One involving falsified land deeds and insurance fraud, right before your accident. Sarah's heart sank. The truth wasn't just painful. It was criminal. And someone out there was willing to do anything to keep it hidden. The folder Lorna Eclair handed to Sarah felt heavier than it should. Not in weight, but in consequence. Back at the ranch, she laid everything out on the kitchen table. Maps, handwritten notes, newspaper clippings. Lorna had uncovered a sealed case from 9 years ago involving a land fraud scheme where livestock, including registered horses, were used as collateral for fake ranch loans. Skylar's original name had appeared in one of those documents. A name Sarah had never heard before, Windsor's Ghost. It didn't make sense at first. Sarah had rescued him from an abandoned field, barely alive, nameless and feral. She gave him the name Skylar. But if he'd already been part of a legal document under a different name, then his abandonment had never been random. He had been discarded, hidden. Windsor's Ghost, Sarah whispered, trying to recall if she'd ever seen that name before. But the file Lorna gave her had something strange. Several pages were missing. Torn out. Someone didn't want her to know who Skylar had belonged to before. Someone had deliberately erased pieces of the past. Sarah took a breath, stood up, and walked to the barn where Skylar rested in his stall. His head lifted when he heard her boots. She pressed her forehead to his, eyes closed. "They tried to erase you," she whispered. "But you're still here. And now we know why." His body leaned gently into hers, like an answer without words. Later that night, as rain began to fall over the fields, Sarah received a second envelope slipped under her front gate. No return address. Inside, a single photograph. Old, grainy, showing Skylar as a younger, healthier stallion, standing beside someone she recognized instantly. Judge Harold Custard. And not in a courtroom, but in front of a barn marked with the same emblem Sarah now used on her ranch. Her father's ranch. That was the missing piece. Her family had once done business with the judge, years before she took over the property. Skylar had been part of that deal. He wasn't just her rescue. He was hers all along. Taken through forged documents, lost during her illness, and buried beneath a tangle of lies. Her father had never told her. And now he was gone. A quiet rage grew in her chest. They didn't just take Skylar. They stole a piece of her legacy. And now, Sarah was done playing nice. The fall festival was supposed to be a peaceful event. Hayrides, apple cider, and smiling families. But Sarah had no intention of blending in with the crowd. Dressed in a simple black jacket and jeans, she walked into the town square with the photograph in one hand and the original property file in the other. The judge was scheduled to give a short speech at noon, like he did every year. But this time, someone else would have the floor when he stepped up. Lorna Eclair waited near the stage, recorder hidden in her coat pocket. Dean Butterscotch stood by the horse trailers, quietly watching, unsure if Sarah would really go through with it. Skylar, now resting safely at home, wasn't there, but his presence was felt in every step Sarah took. The truth wasn't just personal anymore. It belonged to the whole town. Because for years, people had trusted a man who used his robe and reputation to cover his tracks. When Judge Harold Custard walked onto the stage, applause followed, but it wasn't as loud as usual. He noticed. And he noticed Sarah, too. Their eyes locked. She stepped forward without waiting for permission. "Before you speak," she said loudly, "there's something everyone here deserves to know." The crowd quieted. Harold's face froze. Sarah held up the photo, the one of him and Skylar, taken years before. This horse wasn't abandoned. He was stolen, and the man who helped hide it is standing right in front of you. Gasps, whispers, then silence. Harold tried to laugh it off, but Sarah pulled out the forged documents, Reggie's copies. You changed ownership records while I was unconscious in a hospital bed. You used my father's land and my horse as leverage in a fraudulent deal. And then you tried to erase it all. Lorna stepped forward with her recorder. It's all here. We have the files, the signatures, the missing case records. And now, the public will too. Harold's face flushed red. He opened his mouth to deny it, but the crowd had already begun to murmur. Someone shouted, "Is it true?" Another, "What else have you been hiding?" Sarah didn't flinch. She was done being quiet. She turned to the crowd. "You can't undo the years they took from me. Or from Skylar. But we can stop this from happening again." Her voice cracked, but she didn't look away. And as the judge stepped down, no longer to applause but to silence, Sarah knew the damage was real. But so era a justica que finalmente comicava a nascer. A week had passed since the confrontation at the festival, but the effects rippled through the town like a stone dropped into still water. Judge Harold Custard had stepped down from his position pending investigation. Lorna Eclair's exposé made front-page news across the state. And for the first time in nearly a decade, Sarah Holt felt the weight on her chest begin to lift. The truth was out. Skylar's name had been cleared, and so had hers. The town, once hesitant and filled with whispers, now looked at Sarah differently. People stopped her in the streets, not with pity or doubt, but with respect. Even Mildred Fudge, who once called Skylar just a broken horse, brought over a basket of muffins and left it on Sarah's porch without a word. The silence spoke volumes. Dean Butterscotch offered to help repair the barn. Tanner McCrumble, ashamed but sincere, stayed on and began rebuilding trust, with Sarah and with himself. But it was Skylar who had changed the most. In the weeks following the showdown, something in him had awakened. Though his sight never returned, he moved with more certainty now. He listened. He responded to Sarah's voice with ears perked and calm breath. One morning, she walked into the barn and found him standing proud, head high, as if he knew, finally, that he was home. Not just in body, but in spirit. He wasn't Windsor's ghost anymore. He was Skylar. Rescued once, reclaimed forever. Sarah began journaling again, something she hadn't done since the day she lost him. Her first entry was simple: "You came back to me in the dark, but you brought light." She was no longer haunted by what had been taken. Instead, she felt driven by what she had reclaimed, not just a horse, but a piece of herself. Her father's legacy. Her dignity. Her voice. On the final Sunday of the season, the town held a small event at the ranch. No press, no speeches. Just neighbors, friends, and quiet faces gathered around as Sarah led Skylar into the paddock. He walked beside her like he always had, steady and graceful. When she stopped, he turned his head toward her, then lowered himself once again, slowly, reverently, into a kneel. No one laughed this time. There were only tears. And in that silence, filled with memory and healing, Sarah knelt beside him, and finally let go of the past.